The jail was quiet, the kind of silence that made every breath echo. A female officer stopped in front of his cell, her badge shining under the dim light. When the prisoner leaned forward and warned her in a low voice, she chuckled coldly. "I don't take advice from prisoners." But moments later, when alarms blared and chaos erupted, she realized too late. His words weren't a game. And what he did next not only saved her life, it left the entire prison in shock. Stay with me until the end, because this story will leave you stunned. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. Officer Sarah Martinez had seen it all in her 8 years at Riverside Correctional Facility. Drug dealers who claimed innocence, violent offenders who blamed their circumstances, and smooth talkers who thought they could manipulate their way to special treatment. At 32, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had learned to read people through steel bars and concrete walls. Her colleagues respected her no-nonsense approach, and the inmates knew better than to test her patience. That Tuesday evening shift started like any other. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah made her rounds through Block D, the maximum security wing that housed the facility's most dangerous criminals. Her keys jingled against her belt with each measured step, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The prisoners watched her pass with varying degrees of interest, some turning away to avoid eye contact, others staring with the calculating gaze of predators sizing up their prey. Cell 47D held Marcus Thompson, a 45-year-old man serving 15 years for armed robbery. Unlike many of the other inmates who either ignored her completely or made inappropriate comments, Marcus always acknowledged her presence with a polite nod. His behavior struck her as odd for someone with his criminal background, but Sarah had learned not to read too much into prison politeness. Manipulation came in many forms behind bars. On this particular evening, something felt different about Marcus. As Sarah approached his cell during her routine security check, she noticed his usual calm demeanor had shifted. He sat on the edge of his narrow cot, his hands clasped together, eyes darting toward the corridor beyond her shoulder. The tension in his posture was unmistakable to someone trained to notice such details. "Everything all right in there, Thompson?" Sarah asked, stopping directly in front of the cell door. Her tone was professional, but carried the authority that came with years of managing dangerous individuals. Marcus looked up at her, his weathered face creased with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Officer Martinez, I need to tell you something important." His voice was barely above a whisper, forcing Sarah to step closer to the bars to hear him clearly. Sarah's instincts immediately went on high alert. In her experience, when prisoners claimed to have important information, they were usually trying to negotiate for something in return: reduced sentences, better cell assignments, or simply attention from authority figures. She had heard every sob story and witnessed every manipulation tactic in the book. "Go ahead," she said, her voice flat and uninviting. She crossed her arms, creating a physical barrier that communicated her skepticism before Marcus even spoke. Marcus glanced around nervously before continuing. "There's something happening tonight that you need to know about, something that could put you and other officers in danger." His eyes met hers directly, and for a moment, Sarah saw something she didn't expect: genuine fear. The statement caught her off guard, but only for a second. Sarah had learned to maintain her composure regardless of what prisoners threw at her. Claims of danger, threats against staff, and warnings about impending violence were common tactics used by inmates seeking to create chaos or gain leverage over their situation. "What kind of danger?" she asked, her tone remaining skeptical. Years of dealing with manipulative behavior had taught her to question everything, especially information that seemed designed to create urgency or fear. Marcus leaned closer to the bars, lowering his voice even further. "There's going to be an attempt on your life tonight, during the shift change at 11. They've been planning this for weeks, and they specifically chose you as the target." Sarah's expression hardened. This type of claim was particularly common among inmates seeking to create drama or position themselves as informants. The idea that prisoners would target her specifically seemed far-fetched, especially considering her reputation for fairness and professionalism. She had never given any inmate reason to single her out for violence. "Who exactly is they, Thompson?" Sarah demanded, her voice taking on the sharp edge she reserved for inmates who wasted her time with false information. "I can't give you names without putting myself at serious risk," Marcus replied, his hands gripping the cell bars. "But I'm telling you the truth. They're planning to corner you in the West Corridor during the shift transition when fewer officers are around." Sarah let out a cold laugh, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. The absurdity of the situation struck her as almost comical. Here was a convicted armed robber, someone who had terrorized innocent people for money, trying to convince her that he possessed life-saving information. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I don't take advice from prisoners," she stated firmly, her voice carrying a mixture of disdain and amusement, especially not from someone serving time for threatening people with weapons. Marcus's face fell at her dismissive response. "Officer Martinez, please listen to me. This isn't about games or trying to get something from you. I'm telling you this because I've seen what these men are capable of, and I don't want to see anyone get hurt." Sarah shook her head, already turning away from the cell. "Save the concerned citizen act for someone who might believe it, Thompson. I've heard every story in the book, and yours isn't particularly creative." As she prepared to continue her rounds, Marcus called out one more time. "At least stay away from the West Corridor tonight. Please. If I'm wrong, you've lost nothing. If I'm right, you might save your own life." Sarah paused for a moment, not because she believed him, but because something in his voice gave her pause. The desperation seemed genuine, but she had learned the hard way that the most dangerous prisoners were often the most convincing actors. They had years to perfect their manipulation skills, and she refused to become another officer who fell for their schemes. "Good night, Thompson," she said without turning around, her footsteps resuming their steady rhythm down the corridor. Behind her, Marcus slumped back onto his cot, his face a mask of frustration and worry. He had tried to warn her, but like so many others before her, Officer Martinez had dismissed his concerns as the ramblings of a desperate criminal. What she didn't know was that Marcus Thompson had once been a different man entirely, with skills and knowledge that extended far beyond armed robbery. The evening wore on with typical prison routine. Dinner trays were collected, recreational time ended, and the facility began its transition into night mode. Sarah completed her paperwork, updated security logs, and prepared for the shift change that occurred every evening at 11 o'clock sharp. As 10:45 approached, Sarah gathered her equipment for the final security sweep before the night shift took over. Her radio crackled with routine communications between officers, the familiar chatter of a prison winding down for another evening. She clipped her flashlight to her belt and headed toward the West Corridor, the same route she had taken every night for the past 3 years. The West Corridor stretched before her like a concrete tunnel, lined with administrative offices that emptied out after evening hours. During shift changes, this area became a dead zone where fewer officers patrolled, making it the perfect shortcut between the main cell blocks and the security office. Sarah had walked this path hundreds of times without incident. What she didn't realize was that Marcus Thompson wasn't just another armed robber with a sob story. 20 years earlier, he had served as a military intelligence officer in the Army, specializing in threat assessment and tactical analysis. His fall from grace had been swift and devastating, driven by a gambling addiction that consumed his savings, his marriage, and ultimately, his integrity. The skills that once made him valuable to his country now served him well in reading the dangerous undercurrents of prison life. For weeks, Marcus had been observing subtle changes in the behavior of certain inmates, hushed conversations that stopped when officers approached, unusual trading of commissary items that suggested planning beyond normal prison commerce. Most telling were the careful observations of officer routines, particularly Sarah's predictable path through the West Corridor during shift changes. The plan, as Marcus had pieced it together through careful listening and observation, was brutally simple. 3 inmates had arranged for a maintenance issue to be reported in the West Corridor, drawing Sarah away from populated areas. During the shift change confusion, when radio communications were focused on transition protocols, they would corner her in the isolated hallway. Their motivation wasn't robbery or escape, but something far more personal and dangerous. Sarah had unknowingly become a target because of an incident 6 months earlier. She had been forced to use pepper spray on an inmate named Rodriguez during a violent altercation in the dining hall. Rodriguez had been injured during the takedown, suffering a broken wrist that required surgery. While the incident was ruled justified by internal affairs, Rodriguez's cellmates had been quietly planning their revenge ever since. As Sarah entered the West Corridor at exactly 10:52, she noticed that several lights were flickering, casting strange shadows on the walls. Her radio buzzed with a maintenance report about electrical issues in this section, explaining the lighting problems. Standard procedure required her to investigate and report back before the area could be cleared for overnight operations. The silence in the corridor felt heavier than usual. Sarah's footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as she made her way toward the reported electrical panel near the administrative offices. Her training had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about the atmosphere felt wrong, but she attributed the feeling to the unusual lighting and her earlier conversation with Marcus Thompson. Behind her, 3 figures emerged from a maintenance alcove that should have been locked. Rodriguez, accompanied by 2 inmates from Block C, moved with practiced silence toward Sarah's position. They had been hiding in the alcove for over an hour, waiting for this exact moment when the corridor would be empty and Sarah would be alone. Rodriguez carried a sharpened piece of metal fashioned from a broken mop handle, while his companions wielded improvised weapons created from everyday prison items. Their plan was to incapacitate Sarah quickly, take her keys and radio, and create enough chaos to facilitate a larger disturbance that would mask their true intentions. Meanwhile, in cell 47D, Marcus paced frantically in the small space. The shift change was happening exactly as he had predicted, and Officer Martinez had walked directly into the trap despite his warnings. His military training screamed at him to take action, but his position as a prisoner limited his options dramatically. The sound of Sarah's footsteps had faded as she moved deeper into the corridor, followed by the nearly silent movement of her would-be attackers. Marcus knew that within minutes, the situation would escalate beyond anyone's control. The violence wouldn't end with Sarah, and other officers responding to the incident would walk into an ambush, making a decision that would change everything. Marcus began shouting at the top of his lungs, not random screaming, but specific warnings that echoed through the concrete structure of the prison. Officer down in West Corridor, multiple suspects armed. Officer Martinez in immediate danger. His voice carried through the ventilation system and bounced off the walls, reaching the central security station where Officer Williams was monitoring the shift change. Williams grabbed his radio immediately, calling for backup and rushing toward the West Corridor with 2 other guards. Sarah heard the shouting behind her and spun around, her hand instinctively moving to her radio. In that moment of distraction, she saw Rodriguez and his companions advancing toward her with weapons raised. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Marcus Thompson had been telling the truth. Without hesitation, Sarah activated her emergency alarm and drew her pepper spray, but the 3 attackers were already too close. Rodriguez lunged forward with his improvised blade, aiming for her torso, while his companions moved to flank her from both sides. The attack would have succeeded if not for Marcus's continued shouting, which provided crucial seconds of warning and brought help rushing toward the scene. Officer Williams and his backup team rounded the corner just as Rodriguez made his move, their flashlights illuminating the assault in progress. "Stop! Get on the ground now!" Williams shouted, his weapon drawn and trained on the attackers. The sudden appearance of armed officers caused Rodriguez's companions to freeze, But Rodriguez himself continued his assault, too committed to his revenge to stop. Sarah managed to deploy her pepper spray directly into Rodriguez's face, causing him to stumble backward while clutching his eyes. The chemical agent filled the narrow corridor, affecting everyone in the immediate area, but giving Sarah the crucial moments she needed to retreat toward the backup officers. In the chaos that followed, Rodriguez was tackled and restrained while his accomplices surrendered without further resistance. Sarah stood against the wall, her heart pounding as the reality of how close she had come to serious injury began to sink in. The improvised blade lay on the floor where Rodriguez had dropped it, its sharpened edge gleaming under the flickering lights. As additional officers secured the scene and medical personnel were called to treat the effects of pepper spray exposure, Sarah's mind kept returning to one inescapable fact. Marcus Thompson, a convicted felon serving time for armed robbery, had saved her life by raising the alarm when he had absolutely nothing to gain from doing so. Officer Williams approached her as the immediate crisis subsided. "Martinez, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" His concern was evident as he helped her move away from the contaminated area. "I'm okay," Sarah replied, though her voice shook slightly. "But there's someone I need to talk to, someone who tried to warn me about this, and I didn't listen." The medical team finished treating the pepper spray exposure while investigators began documenting the crime scene. Sarah found herself standing in the administrative hallway, surrounded by evidence markers and the lingering chemical smell that made her eyes water. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a profound sense of vulnerability she hadn't experienced since her rookie days. 20 minutes later, after giving her initial statement to Internal Affairs, Sarah made her way back to Block D. Her steps were slower now, weighted with the knowledge of how drastically wrong things could have gone. The other officers had tried to convince her to go home early, but she needed to finish something first. Cell 47D came into view, and she could see Marcus sitting on his cot, his head in his hands. He looked up as her footsteps approached, his expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The man who had been dismissed as just another manipulative prisoner now appeared entirely different to her trained eye. Sarah stopped in front of his cell, her hand resting on the cold metal bars. The silence stretched between them for several seconds before she found her voice. "You saved my life tonight," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than any official commendation ever could. Marcus looked up, his weathered face showing genuine surprise at her presence. "I'm just glad you're okay, Officer Martinez. I was afraid my warning came too late when I heard the commotion in the corridor." Sarah studied his face, searching for signs of the manipulation she had been trained to detect. Instead, she saw something that challenged everything she thought she knew about reading people. This wasn't the calculated expression of someone working an angle. This was genuine concern from someone who had risked his own safety to protect hers. "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing a dozen questions. Why warn her? Why risk retaliation from other inmates? Why care about the safety of a corrections officer when his own situation was already precarious? Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because some things matter more than the circumstances that brought you to a place like this. I've made terrible choices in my life. Choices that hurt innocent people and destroyed my family. But sitting by and watching someone get hurt when I could prevent it, that's not something I can live with." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. Sarah had heard countless explanations from inmates over the years, elaborate justifications for their crimes and promises of redemption that rang hollow. This was different. Marcus wasn't trying to minimize his crimes or paint himself as a victim. He was simply explaining why he had chosen to act. "How did you know?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about how he had pieced together information that had escaped the attention of trained security personnel. Marcus shifted on his cot, his expression becoming more serious. "You learn to pay attention in here. Your survival depends on reading people and situations correctly. Rodriguez had been talking about you for months, ever since the incident in the dining hall. At first, it was just anger and resentment, The kind of talk you hear from inmates who feel they've been wronged by the system. He paused, his eyes focusing on something beyond the cell walls as he recalled the details. But over the past few weeks, the talk changed. It became more specific, more focused. Rodriguez started asking questions about your schedule, your routes through the facility. He was trading commissary items for information about security protocols during shift changes. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized how methodically her attackers had planned the assault. Why didn't you report this through official channels? There are procedures for inmates to report threats against staff. Marcus let out a bitter laugh, but there was no malice in it. Officer Martinez, what's the first thing that happens when a prisoner files an official report about other inmates? They investigate, they ask questions, and eventually, everyone knows who provided the information. In a place like this, being labeled a snitch is often a death sentence. The brutal reality of prison politics struck Sarah with new clarity. She had always known that inmates operated under their own code of conduct, but she had never fully appreciated how that code could prevent them from seeking help through official channels, even when lives were at stake. "So you chose to warn me directly instead," Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn on her. "I figured if I could convince you to change your routine, even for one night, it might be enough to disrupt their plan. I didn't expect you to believe me, but I had to try." Sarah felt a wave of shame wash over her as she remembered her dismissive response to his warning. Her training and experience had led her to automatically categorize his concern as manipulation, causing her to ignore information that could have prevented the entire incident. "I'm sorry I didn't listen," she said, the apology carrying genuine remorse. "My experience with inmates has made me skeptical of claims like yours, even when they might be legitimate." Marcus nodded understandingly. "You can't blame yourself for being cautious, Officer Martinez. In your position, you probably hear a lot of stories from people trying to work the system. The fact that you came back to talk to me now shows the kind of person you are." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Captain Morrison, Sarah's supervisor, accompanied by Detective Reynolds from the local police department. Morrison's expression was grim as he addressed both Sarah and Marcus through the cell bars. "Thompson, we need to discuss your involvement in tonight's incident," Morrison said, his tone official but not hostile. "Your actions potentially saved Officer Martinez's life, and we need to understand exactly how you came by the information you provided." Marcus straightened on his cot, his military bearing becoming more apparent as he addressed the senior officers. "I'm willing to cooperate fully with any investigation, Captain, but I need assurance that my cooperation won't result in retaliation from other inmates." Detective Reynolds stepped forward, his notebook already open. "We're prepared to take steps to ensure your safety during the investigation process. However, we need you to provide specific details about what you observed and who was involved in planning the attack." The next hour was spent in detailed questioning as Marcus provided investigators with a comprehensive account of the conversations he had overheard, the behavioral changes he had observed, and the specific indicators that had led him to conclude an attack was imminent. His military background became apparent as he delivered his information with precision and tactical awareness that impressed both Morrison and Reynolds. Sarah listened to the interrogation from the corridor, amazed by the depth of Marcus's observations and the analytical skills he had applied to protecting her safety. This wasn't the random warning of a concerned prisoner, but the calculated threat assessment of someone with professional training in security matters. As the questioning concluded, Detective Reynolds closed his notebook and addressed Marcus directly. "Your information has been extremely valuable to our investigation. We'll be recommending that the District Attorney's Office consider your cooperation when reviewing your case." Marcus shook his head firmly. "I didn't do this looking for any kind of deal or reduced sentence. I did it because it was the right thing to do. If the system chooses to recognize that, fine. If not, I can live with that too." The integrity of his response struck everyone present. In a system where inmates routinely traded information for personal advantage, Marcus's refusal to leverage his heroic actions for personal gain set him apart in a way that couldn't be ignored. Captain Morrison made notes in his incident report before addressing Sarah. Martinez Barquin, I'm recommending you take the rest of the week off to recover from this incident. When you return, we'll be implementing new security protocols based on what we've learned tonight. Sarah nodded, but her attention remained focused on Marcus. Captain, what happens to Thompson now? If word gets out that he provided information about the attack, his safety here could be compromised. Morrison considered this carefully. We'll be reviewing his security classification and housing assignment. Given the circumstances and his cooperation, there may be options for protective custody or transfer to a different facility. As the officials prepared to leave, Sarah lingered by Marcus's cell. The man who had been just another inmate to her a few hours earlier had become something entirely different. Not just because he had saved her life, but because he had challenged her assumptions about human nature and redemption. What you did tonight, Sarah said, her voice carrying deep respect. It shows who you really are underneath everything else. I misjudged you, and I'm sorry for that. Marcus met her eyes through the bars, his expression thoughtful. We all make judgments based on limited information, Officer Martinez. The important thing is being willing to reconsider those judgments when new evidence presents itself. You've done that tonight, and it speaks well of your character. The profound conversation between a corrections officer and an inmate reflected a truth that both had discovered through crisis. People were more complex than their worst actions, and redemption was possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. As Sarah finally prepared to leave the facility, she realized that this night had changed more than just her opinion of Marcus Thompson. It had challenged her fundamental approach to her job and her understanding of the people in her care. The prisoners weren't just criminals to be managed, but human beings capable of both great harm and unexpected heroism. The security footage from that evening would become part of training materials used throughout the correctional system. But the real lesson couldn't be captured on video. Sometimes the most important warnings come from the most unexpected sources, and dismissing them based on preconceived notions can have life or death consequences. Word of the incident spread quickly through the prison population over the following days. Marcus found himself in an unusual position, simultaneously respected by some inmates for his courage and targeted by others for his cooperation with authorities. The complex social dynamics of prison life meant that his heroic actions created both admirers and enemies. 3 days after the incident, Sarah returned to work with a new perspective that went beyond simple gratitude. The administration had moved Marcus to protective custody, pending his transfer to a minimum security facility, but not before Sarah had one final conversation that would reshape everything she thought she knew about justice and redemption. She found him in the segregation unit, reading a worn paperback novel in his temporary cell. The isolation was necessary for his protection, but it also meant 23 hours a day in a space barely larger than a bathroom. When he saw her approaching, Marcus set down his book and stood with the same respectful posture she had initially dismissed as calculated behavior. I wanted to thank you properly before your transfer, Sarah said, her voice carrying none of the professional distance she typically maintained with inmates. And I wanted to ask you something that's been bothering me since that night. Marcus nodded, settling back onto his narrow inmates protect each other. Form Officer Martinez. Sarah hesitated, choosing cot. What's on your mind? Her words carefully. In all my years here, I've seen alliances even show loyalty to their groups, but I've never seen someone risk their own safety to protect a corrections officer with no expectation of reward. What made you different? The question hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went beyond simple curiosity. Marcus was quiet for several moments, his eyes focused on something beyond the concrete walls of his temporary cell. 15 years ago, I was a different person, he began, his voice taking on a reflective quality Sarah hadn't heard before. I was a staff sergeant in military intelligence, stationed overseas. My job was threat assessment and personnel protection for high-ranking officials in hostile environments. Sarah leaned forward, intrigued by this glimpse into Marcus's past. His file had mentioned military service, but the details had been sparse, and she had never thought to inquire further. "I was good at my job," Marcus continued. "Really good. I could read situations, identify potential threats, and coordinate protective measures that kept people alive in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. My commanding officers trusted my judgment completely." He paused, running his hand through his graying hair. "But I had a problem that eventually destroyed everything I had built. Gambling. It started small, just weekend poker games with other soldiers, but it escalated into something that consumed every aspect of my life." Sarah remained silent, recognizing that Marcus was sharing something deeply personal that might explain the contradiction between his criminal record and his actions that night. "By the time I returned stateside, I owed money to people who didn't accept payment plans," Marcus said with bitter honesty. "My marriage fell apart, my savings disappeared, and I was facing threats against my family. That's when I made the worst decision of my life." The weight of confession settled over the small cell as Marcus prepared to reveal the details that had led to his current circumstances. "I robbed 3 convenience stores in 2 weeks," he said quietly. "Not because I was desperate for drug money or because I enjoyed hurting people. I was trying to raise enough cash to pay off debts that were putting my ex-wife and daughter in danger." Sarah felt her understanding of Marcus shift once again. This wasn't the typical criminal history she was accustomed to hearing. There was no glorification of violence, no attempt to minimize responsibility, just raw honesty about choices made under extreme pressure. "I never intended to hurt anyone," Marcus continued. "I used an unloaded weapon and chose locations where I knew the employees would comply rather than resist. But intention doesn't matter when you're terrifying innocent people trying to do their jobs." The parallel between his past victims and Sarah's own position as a working professional wasn't lost on either of them. Marcus had once been on the other side of such encounters, using his desperation to justify actions that traumatized others. "The 3rd robbery went wrong," Marcus said, his voice growing heavy with regret. "A customer entered the store while I was at the counter, and in my panic, I grabbed the clerk's arm too roughly. She fell and broke her wrist. That injury, that moment of violence born from my fear and desperation, it haunts me every single day." Sarah began to understand the complexity of the man sitting across from her. His actions that night hadn't been those of someone seeking redemption or trying to balance cosmic scales. They had been the instinctive response of someone who had learned, through terrible personal experience, the cost of allowing harm to come to innocent people. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson walked out of Riverside Correctional Facility as a free man, his sentence reduced due to extraordinary circumstances and exemplary behavior. Sarah Martinez stood waiting by the gate, no longer just a corrections officer who had misjudged an inmate, but someone who understood that redemption comes in the most unexpected forms. Their story became a training case study used in correctional facilities nationwide, proving that sometimes the most valuable warnings come from the most unlikely sources. Marcus returned to his family, using his experience to counsel other veterans struggling with addiction. Sarah became an advocate for prison reform, pushing for programs that recognized the humanity in every person behind bars. The lesson they both learned that night echoed through everything they did afterward. Never dismiss someone based solely on their worst moment, because within every person lies the capacity for both destruction and heroism. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal which one will emerge. What started as a routine evening shift became a testament to the power of second chances and the importance of listening, even when the voice comes from behind prison bars. In the end, Marcus didn't just save Sarah's life. He reminded everyone that redemption is always possible for those willing to choose courage over comfort.